Friends, we were discussing structuralism and structural theories in the previous session, and we decided to pick up the threads from interpreting the codes and signs in the previous session. Now, while interpreting the codes and signs, if the process of interpreting a sign always generates another sign, the representamen, then semiosis could potentially go on forever. Semioticians call this condition semiotic drift. For the Italian semiotician and novelist Umberto Eco says that the possible meanings generated by a sign, although hypothetically unlimited, are in actuality confined by a social and cultural context. For example, a bearded shepherd is Jesus because we are known about Christianity. Same goes on for a figure of a mother with a child as Virgin and Christ child. Our knowledge, culture, reference point put a limit on the range of interpretations we can create. It is important to remember that context. It is not given, it is produced. The cultural reality that restricts semiosis is a creation of the community. It may be an arbitrary pseudo-reality, but its effect is nonetheless powerful. The idea that signs relate to each other, that they are part of a larger context and not closed, discrete little units of signification, was also emphasized by the French semiotician Julia Kristeva. In the 60s and 70s, Kristeva was one of the group of post-structuralist thinkers associated with the radical journal Tel Quel, in which she published some of her most important writings. Kristeva developed the concept of intertextuality to explore the ways that texts or signs actually refer to each other. The question of intertextuality relates too to the way that signs signify both directly and indirectly, indicated by the terms denotation and connotation. Denotation indicates the meaning of a sign that are obvious or generally recognized. Connotation refers to the meaning of the sign that are less obvious, that are inferred. It's the interpreter's job to bring the relevant codes to the process of interpreting the sign. For example, for most, the word rose denotes a fragrant flower with multiple petals and thorns. The word rose also has many connotations. It suggests romance, purity, elegance. While the word rose may readily connote romance for you, only if you bring the code of knowledge of English language and the portrayal of rose as a romantic gift as a context. In art history and sign making, we can see that in the 60s, American art historian Meyer Shapiro, who lived from 1904 to 1996, had already to explore the idea of semiotic analysis in the visual arts. In 1969, he published an important essay on some problems in the semiotics of visual arts, field, artist and society, in which he links the formal analysis of works of art with the examination of their social and cultural history. Meyer Shapiro explored interplay of text, commentary, symbolism and representation. Taking simple examples of a godlike figure with raised hands, Shapiro talks about such reverent figures in various cultures and thus showing how a picture is read and had its layers in meaning. The raised hands of Moses in Exodus and like the raised hands of Christ on the cross. The readings of motions belong to the vertical Saussurean axis, that of paradigmatic and associative structures or metaphors. Taking one element on the associative scale and interpret various meanings which also contribute to the horizontal, syntagmatic and metonymic. Therefore, Shapiro observed that meaning and artistic form are not easily separated in representation. For example, the representative choice of depicting a figure in frontal or profile view can determine the meaning of rank, stature or show a ritual of a dramatic effect. Shapiro, in his paper Field and Vehicle in Image Science, he talks about the relation between the ground or the field on which a painting is made. In particular, he focuses on the relationship between a painted image and the surface, the ground on which it is painted. The issue of whether or not the image is framed in any way. Cave painters in prehistoric times did not really distinguish the background as clear or often drew images on one another as well over time. It is Neolithic times that the smooth field emerged and sometimes the surface started to be used, such as the bulges and the crevices of the cave walls were used to enhance the painting. As such, he then compares to child who, pre-language state, does not distinguish between the wall and the paper, and it is only through language of a yes and a no of parents that he understands the distinction. Just as Saussure has said that speech or parole is learned through distinction, that a yes is a yes because it is not its opposite no. Shapiro traces artistry in terms of this distinction of field background and foreground. Graffiti artists, for example, disregard the restriction by painting on the walls. Thus, language through binaries like do and don't have created a moral and social background which then represent morality, order and control, and the opposite would be disorder. Many examples of framing of words can be talked about. Egyptians made horizontal lines to distinguish. Assyrian reliefs have text and images together for the viewer to experience. And in 15th century, in Italy, appears the concept of framed window and a viewer looking out through the window, where painting imitates linear perspective. In the 20th century, frames were not as important because painting became non-representational. Shapiro wrote about the positions of frames and the left and right orientation of the elements within the work, as well as the frame itself as a sign, along with the meaning associated over time to these elements. Norman Bryson also conceived the work of art as a visual system or a sign. For him, these signs are culture, when decoded, reveal society and the role of these in the society. He does not limit himself to language but brings signs to be associated with the society. He maintains that works reveal what has been hidden by previous choices of representation and approaches to image making. Art is dynamic and is part of the process of cultural circulation. He combines formalism and iconography with structuralism. To bring a more comprehensive view of art, let us look at a comparison of the works given by Bryson. Bryson says that Giotto represents the kiss of Judas with more details. He goes on to talk about the signs within the work, like the straight line of Jesus' forehead, signifying in connotative sense straightness and being right. Jesus' posture of being higher than Judas, moral superiority, higher than ground, etc. He goes on to describe and read many more works in the same manner. For signs to be read, there is effort on the part of the viewer, and for structure, commodities to be established there in more work. In an influential essay on Poussin, the Arcadian shepherds, the French art historian Louis Martin addressed the challenges inherent in using semiotic theory, which had largely developed in language to interpret the visual arts. He focused part of the issue of Deixis, the direction of an utterance. Every utterance exists in space and time. It is produced by a speaker, that is sender, and sent to a listener, that is receiver, in a particular context that brings them together. The dialectic traits of an utterance include things such as personal pronouns, verbs, adverbs, of time
It's 2
and
o'clock.
place. So, how do we translate this to works of art, especially history paintings like Poussin's, which don't seem to address anyone in particular? Martin points out that except for the physical existence of the painting and the fact that we are looking at it, nothing within the image tells us about its situation or emission and reception. It does not address the viewer with, say, a figure who looks out of the picture. As viewers, we seem simply to catch sight of the figures in the painting going about the business, as if they don't need us in order to perform their story. In this way, the painting conceals its enunciated structure. And yet, curiously, the concealment of enunciative structure and their reappearance and representation is the painting's very subject. A shepherd traces the whole it in Arcadia Ego on a tomb, words that address the shepherds but in an open-ended way. For the verb is missing from the phrase I too in Arcadia is the literal translation of the Latin. Marin's reading, which involves subtle textual and visual analysis, reveals a Jacobsonian model of communication as the subject matter of the painting, with the painter or the viewer occupying the position of the linguist who constructs a model. Marin's essay is doubly important because it reminds us that theory is not a one-way street. It is not just that the theory is applied to the interpretation of art, but that the interpretation of art can alter our understanding of the theory too. Although Dutch scholar Meg Baal is literary critic by training, she has made significant contribution to semiotics of art. She emphasizes that the work of art is an event, one that takes place each time as an image is processed by a viewer. In this way, the work of art is an agent too, an active producer of the viewer's experience and ultimately of the viewer's subjectivity. The task of semiotic art history is to analyze simultaneously the image and the interpretation of the image, the relation between the two. Why does a subject interpret it in a particular way? And the anchoring of the image in the interpretation and vice versa. She points out that the established iconographic approach in art history emphasizes what is common to image, the history of types, for example, rather than what is distinctive about a particular image and a particular viewer's way of approaching that image. Paradoxically, she says, although iconography may claim to have been developed uniquely for visual images, it may, in fact, ignore their unique qualities. Conflict between the word and the image. Many of the issues pertaining to iconography and semiotics have more recently been framed as the word and the image problem is an important one. What is the relationship between text and images? Do visual images simply illustrate the text? Do text control images? Or is there a form of dialogue between them? What does it mean for an art historian to bring words to bear on the interpretation of images? The first part of this problem is the relationship between the text and the image, especially within works of art that themselves contain images. Each art, each type of sign or medium lays claim to certain things that it is best equipped to mediate, and each grounds its claim in a certain characterization of itself, its own proper essence. Equally important, each art characterizes itself in opposition to its significant other. In Iconology, Image, Text, Ideology, 1986, and Picture Theory, Essays on Verbal and Visual Representation, that is in 1994, W.J.T. Mitchell argued that both visual and verbal representations have an inseparable formal uniqueness as processes and representation, even though they are often linked to each other through previous artistic practices and social and political contexts. A number of art historians and structuralists have explored the theme of text and image and extrapolated the theory of structuralism to examine the myths. The French semiotician Roland Barthes argues that denotative meanings are also not natural, but as Saussure puts it, arbitrary and assignment. He said, denotation is not the first meaning, but pretends to be so. Under this illusion, it is ultimately no more than the last of the connotation, the one that seems both to establish and does the reading, the superior myth by which the text pretends to return to the nature of language, to language as nature. Barthes elaborated this argument with examples from advertising and photography, and a number of art historians have responded to these ideas, not least because they present indirectly a critique of the notion of the innocent eye. Barthes' influential work, Elements of Semiology, published in 1964, applies a Saussurean framework to popular images such as cartoons and advertising. We usually associate myths with classical fables about the exploits of gods and heroes. But for Barthes, myths were the dominant ideologies of our own times. He calls the connotative meaning in our modern world as myths and illustrates it with following examples. I am at the barber's and a copy of Paris Match is offered to me. On the cover, a young black boy, term not used by author, in a French uniform is saluting with his eye uplifted, probably fixed on the fold of the tricolor. All this is the meaning of the picture. But whether naively or not, I see very well what it signifies to me. That France is a great empire, that all her sons, without any color discrimination, faithfully serve under her flag, and there is no better answer to the detractors of an alleged colonialism than the zeal shown by this black boy in serving his so-called oppressors. I am therefore again faced with a greater semiological system. There is a signifier. It's already formed with a previous system. A black soldier is giving the French salute. There is a signified. It is here a purposeful mixture of the Frenchness and the militariness. Finally, there is a presence of the signified through the signifier. In myth, and this is the chief peculiarity of the latter, the signifier is already formed by the signs of the language. Myth has in fact a double function. It points out and it notifies. It makes us understand something and it imposes it on us. One must put the biography of the black boy in parenthesis if one wants to free the picture and prepare it to receive its signified. The form does not suppress the meaning, it only impoverishes it. It puts it at a distance. It is the constant game of hide and seek between the meaning and the form which defines the myth. The form of a myth is not a symbol. The black boy who salutes is not the symbol of the French Empire. He has too much of presence. He appears as a rich, fully experienced, spontaneous, innocent, indisputable image. But at the same time, this presence is tamed, put at a distance, made almost transparent. It recedes a little, it becomes the accomplice of a concept which comes to a fully armed French imperiality. Myth is defined by its intention, much more by its literal sense. In spite of this, its intention is somehow frozen, purified, eternalized, made absent by the literal sense. The French Empire is just a fact. Look at this good black boy. Again, this term is not used by the author, who salutes like one of our own boys. This constituent ambiguity has two consequences for the signification, which henceforth appears both like a notification and like a statement of fact. French imperiality condemns the saluting black boy, term not used by the author, must be reminded, to be nothing more than an instrumental signifier. The black boy suddenly hails me in the name of French imperiality. But at the same moment, the boy salutes, thickens, becomes petrified, freezes into an eternal reference meant to establish French imperiality. We reach here the very principle of myth. It transforms history into nature. In the case of the soldier boy, what is got rid of is certainly not the French imperiality. On the contrary, since what must be actualized is its presence. It is the cognizant, historical, in one word, fabricated quality of colonialism. Myth does not deny things. On the contrary, its function is to talk about them. Simply, it purifies them, it makes them innocent, it gives them a natural and eternal justification, it gives them a clarity which is not that of an explanation but that of a statement of fact. If I state the fact of French imperiality without explaining it, I am very near to finding that it is natural and goes without saying. I am reassured. In passing from history to nature, myth acts economically. It abolishes the complexity of human acts. It gives them the simplicity of essence. It does away with dialectics, with any going back beyond what is immediately visible. It organizes a world which is without contradictions. Things appear to mean something by themselves. Rolla is the semiotician who then moves theory from structuralism to post-structuralism.